Anybody remember when Apple made a big deal about Apple Arcade? It's not that they're not adding to the service, as even according to their own press pages, they're constantly updating it with games. But is there a bigger play here? Keep in mind that this is not fact and this idea is all theories, and look, I could be way off base and wrong, but history has a strange way of repeating itself. So today's date is July the 1st, 2025, and there's a rumor out there right now that a new MacBook device with the same A18 Pro processor as you find in the iPhone 16 Pro in development. So try not to laugh too hard at this theory, as there are other YouTubers with videos out there wildly predicting and speculating about the low price. But here's the thing, how does Apple Arcade factor into all of this? To really make this theory land, we need to go back to the beginnings of Apple Silicon, because look, there is a pattern here. If we go way back to 2008, Steve Jobs declared that it's time that Apple designed their own chips for iPhone and iPods. iPods, remember those? Apple has famously said that Apple Silicon in these new Macs are based off what they learned from developing iPhone. But if you're old enough to remember this transition to Apple Silicon, look, it didn't go well for them internally. At least the public-facing side of that, it didn't go well for them over the years. Here's an article from author Brendan Neidstedt. Sorry about the pronunciation, I suck at this. Brendan posted this on Wired in 2018, reviewing the 15-inch MacBook Pro. The article, which I'll link in the description if you like history that is, it sums up the review with this. Apple's made a lot of noise lately about taking the needs of pros seriously. But I've used this finished product for a while and have to wonder about that, because if you let creative professionals design the 2018 MacBook Pro, I think it'd look a whole lot different than it does right now. I think it would be more modular, have a higher res screen, a normal keyboard without a superfluous touch bar, and a wider array of useful ports. Did I pronounce superfluous right? Sure. Let's be clear, Apple did in fact ask for feedback from creative professionals, but since then, they've become a much more polarizing brand, and gone are the days of live keynotes. The attempt at secrecy, look, that's still there, which I guess is good in its own right, because it makes creators like me speculate wildly. Well, it makes us try to anyway. But then in 2020, we get the Apple Silicon Macs, and subsequently in 2021, we get a redesigned-ish MacBook Pro. For context, here are the two side by side, and they look very, very similar. And to really make this point about design, the 2018 really only lasted about 2 years, and that is actually insanely short for Apple. And what that tells me is that they were planning to go Apple Silicon all along. Look, the 2018 through the 2020 Intel machines were probably a response for the anger about the butterfly keyboard. Side note, you psychopaths out there who actually like the keyboard, like the butterfly keyboard, you are just that. Psychopaths. Remember, this chassis that we have in 2025, this chassis was always in play. Those models for those 2 years were probably based on a design for the newest MacBook Pros that we're using today. But it was sort of a mid-development design, because when we got the 2021 M1 MacBook Pro, it was a little bit thicker than the 2020. It had a notch and it ushered in a new era. Not to mention, we got HDMI back, we got MagSafe back, we got a card reader. Like, how long were they actually planning this whole thing? My conspiracy theory is that Apple almost wanted people to believe that they forgot about the professional video space. Look at Brian Fagioli's article, also from 2018, and also my pronunciation of Brian's name is awful. Anyway, his article from 2018 from betanews.com titled, "Dear Apple, I don't need a fancy iPad Pro for sitting on the toilet." Now that's a title. The commonality of opinions here is perfectly summed up at the end with this sentence. Strangely, as Apple began ignoring the professional users with its non-upgradable MacBook Pro line and laughably outdated Mac Pro, it began losing focus on the true iPad buyer, casual media consumers. Here's the thing though, did they lose focus entirely? People who call themselves professional users these days are actually buying up Apple Silicon Macs. Anyway, a few years after that article, we get Apple Silicon. So why do I bring up Apple Arcade? And are they playing 4D chess with us? Let's go back again, but this time let's go to 2023. At WWDC 2023, Apple quietly announced a tool to help developers port Windows games over to Mac. In fact, there's even a tool titled Metal Developer Tools for Windows. When I saw this, I stopped thinking of Apple Arcade strictly as a service, but more as a launcher, similar to Steam. This was ambitious, and at the time, if I'm being completely honest about it, it felt last minute. But hindsight being 2020, and it's been over 2 years since Apple has made any noise really about Apple Arcade, it starts to make you wonder, At this point, Apple Arcade is ran on iPhones, iPads, Macs, and Apple TV devices. The first three on this list being something that gets passed on to younger generations typically, like the older generations will upgrade. And yes, we know Apple makes money on people upgrading, but there's an untapped segment here that's kind of been the elephant in the room for a while. But in saying all that, we have to explore other segments in technology. So let's talk about some other options here. There's no denying that there have been some disruptive options and disruptive platforms like the Stream Deck, your Nintendo Switches, your ROG Allies, Lenovo Legion Go's, among others. All very popular choices to gamers. What's stopping Apple from even entering this conversation is their lackluster library of games, and not to mention their obscene pricing structure. Another interesting segment that you really don't talk about when it comes to Apple is Chromebooks. And that market, it's only projected to reach greater heights. So sure, gaming and Chromebooks aren't a conversation when you talk about Apple, but what do they have in common? They're both aimed at a younger audience. Wait, who plays games? Typically, younger audiences. Who has the lower expendable income among this big group of tech enthusiasts? A younger audience. So what if this low-cost Apple device is marketed at this younger audience to handle schoolwork and actual gaming? Again, try not to laugh because let's be honest, like Apple to this point, they've spent a ton of money trying to convince us that people game on iOS. Like you could even pair PlayStation, Xbox controllers, and even Nintendo Joy-Cons to your iOS devices. And you could do that today. And with the advancements of Apple's GPU development and the gap, it's kind of getting interestingly close. The issue now is starting to come down to accessibility. Think about this as well. Remember the iPhone SE? What if instead of making SE phones with spare parts that the tech community has lovingly referred to as the accountant's iPhone, what if they took those spare parts and they decided to just create a new line of Mac? From a business perspective, it's cost effective. And if I'm being honest, I don't think it would cannibalize the MacBook Pro or even iPads because I can't see the media engines in the A18 Pro chip from the iPhone 16 Pro keeping up with even a base model M4. So it's not like you're doing heavy Final Cut editing on that chip. And it makes sense to make this a beefier Chromebook competitor while you're at it. After all, you really can't do homework on an Apple TV. And sure, you can do homework with a phone, but let's be honest, that's not practical. Hot take, what if it's designed in the 12-inch form factor? Remember the 12-inch MacBook with the single port? If I'm not mistaken, I believe they put out a second version of it with 2 ports. But anyway, so 12-inch MacBook, 2 ports at the right price with the right library of games and the right mix of productivity tools for students. And out of the gate, look, that could make some serious waves, not to mention you're literally cultivating an install base of young people who are now going to get used to macOS. And this whole idea is designed to make them used to it from childhood. So that way, as they grow older, they are now going to want to be locked into the ecosystem because they're just used to it. And that's how Apple invests in the future of their company. It's actually kind of a smart play. That is until they forget about developing for it and then they seem to go the way of the HomePod with it. Yeah, I don't know. Is there any merit to any of these ideas? I could be way off base, but this theory sounds like the most Apple thing that Apple could possibly do. Let me know what you think in the comments. My name is Sean. This has been Tech Mixer and I'm out. Peace.